What does it mean to live more with less? I'm Katie Wells, and welcome to the Maximized Minimalist Podcast. If you found yourself caught up in the hamster wheel of modern-day motherhood and want to rewrite the script, congratulations, you're in the right place. I'm here to be your guide and help you take back your motherhood and achieve a simpler, more joy-filled life. Cheers to being a maximized minimalist. Enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the show. We were just laughing. We don't know if it's a second or third time because we talk all the time on Instagram and it all gets muddled. But I am so excited to have this conversation and record it for the podcast listeners. So Dr. Morgan Cutlip, welcome back to the Maximize Minimalist Show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, icebreaker question. This is new, I think, since the last time you're on. If you could magically declutter one thing from your life forever, what would it be?
You didn't even warn me about this. Okay.
That's the point.
I'm like, right now, I am like, my whole house is annoying the crap out of me. So I'm like, one thing? Are you serious right now? One area.
I mean, think big. It could be one item. It could be laundry. It could be a task you don't like. It could be anything.
I wish my closets were always organized. Okay, so the kids' closets, I feel like I'm regularly cleaning them and going through and purging. And then it's like literally the next week they're a mess. And I don't know how it happens. Same with my own closet, actually. Because I'm in a hurry and I throw stuff in there. So constantly organized closets would just be, don't tease me with the prospect. I'm lost in the fantasy.
Well, it's funny because you answered your own question. You're like, I don't know why. But, it's because we're in there and we throw things down in a hurry, right?
Yes.
So simple resets, resetting it back to baseline tidiness. I know you know this because you follow me. But the more consistent we can be with those, then we don't have to wish. It's automatic, right?
Yes.
So anyway, I won't preach to you.
But she can. It's fine. I will. I'll take it. Tell me.
We can do a little coaching call on the side on Instagram. I love it. A little pick me up. It's funny because I feel like so many things in life, and this dovetails right into this conversation we're having, is like, we know, quote unquote, what we should do. We know what we want, but it's like, how do we squeeze that gap and make it smaller between where we are and what we want? And I know the term mental load, I don't know, in my opinion, it's become a bit of a buzzword. And maybe it's because it's like the AI, the algorithm, and you too, because this is your niche, really. I see it all the time. But a lot of us resonate, like we've seen content on it. We know like, the heaviness, we know how real it can feel. So relating to your second book that's out, like what inspired you to dive into this topic? And then we'll get into the nitty gritty of it.
So both of my books were really inspired by my life and just sort of like what I needed. The mental load is something that I feel like exists in couples' relationships, no matter whether they have kids or not. But for me and my own relationship, after our daughter was born, it was like overnight, the amount of responsibilities increased exponentially. And there were two main things I really struggled with in early motherhood and then into parenthood, which is the first was I felt overwhelmed and buried and just kind of lost to myself, which is my first book. But then the second thing is that our relationship shifted really rapidly. And we went into having kids with a fairly strong relationship. I'm in this profession. Like I know how to do this stuff, but I could not believe how quickly I felt like, oh my gosh, why am I doing everything? Why has my life changed? And his seemingly remains the same. And the quick pace at which resentment took root in my own relationship caused me to pause and self-reflect on what's going on. And it took me a while to get there. And then the mental load conversation picked up steam and it provided a label to what I experienced and felt in my own relationship. And I was like, okay, we need, there's incredible information out there about the actual logistics. There's information out there about the societal sort of like injustices. But I wanted to add to this conversation because what's out there to really equip couples to navigate the conversation around it, to talk through it in a way that just doesn't take them down the spiral of defensiveness, because I know that's what I needed in my relationship.
One of the first, I don't know if I ever told you this, but when I found you on Instagram years ago, it was probably when I got on a little late to the game in 2019. You were doing you had like a whiteboard I don't think you do those anymore. I've
Oh
not
my
seen you.
gosh, I
And
want to.
you did like a workshop, a little mini workshop on resentment. And
Yes, it was like
you
15
paint.
minutes.
Yes. So that's how I found you. And I was like, everything she's saying makes so much sense. And just like you talked about, like sometimes being able to zoom out and like define why we're feeling overwhelmed instead of just being like, I'm overwhelmed and assuming it's for one reason or the other, right? It's a nuance, it's layered. But the mental load is, I think, for a lot of us, a huge piece of it. So, the mental load is typically invisible, right? But it's the weight of it is like undeniable. It really is. I remember coming home, even from a vacation, it was a couple years ago. And it was a trip where it was just on the beach, don't do anything. And I started to sob on the plane ride home. And I'm trying to describe to Aunt, he's like, what? Why are you crying? And I'm like, I love our lives we've built at home. Like our lives are simplified. And yet still I get overwhelmed by the mental load of like the doctor's appointments, the dentist, if kids get the flu, I'm responsible. It's like, oh, it's all the things, right? So how do you personally define the mental load? And what are some ways that it shows up in our everyday lives out of the ways I just maybe described?
Yeah, I think this is a really important starting point. So I kind of have like a little bit of a longer answer because I want to give like the 30,000 foot definition and then kind of like in the weeds definition, because I think that's hitting on the second part of your question. And it's also the piece where couples seem to like, that's where like they don't get each other is in the weeds piece. So the 30,000 foot definition is that the mental load is the seemingly never-ending to-do list that we carry around in our minds that has two key components. One, the majority of the stuff involved in it is invisible. So it's hard to explain to our partners. It's hard to outsource. It's hard to just like really even hand off. And it's hard to get appreciated. And then the second piece is that it takes up cognitive real estate. So it just crowds out room for other things like peace, like on your vacation, like the ability to just sink in and be present and relax. It's like it whiplashes you out of the present moment. It takes up space that could be, filled up by memory and regulating your emotions and also getting in the mood for sex. So it really does have a pretty powerful impact in our relationships. So everybody has a mental load. This is like one thing I know that comes up a lot when we go to our partners. We try to talk about it and they're like, well, I have one too. And then it becomes this really frustrating competition. So everyone has one. Research consistently shows that in home and family life is predominantly carried by women, which is where the rub is, which is why it can lead to resentment. Okay, in the weeds definition, there are 3 types of tasks associated with the mental load. So if we imagine a Venn diagram, the first circle those are the physical tasks. So stereotypical relationships, this is like where men shine. It's like, I'll mow the lawn. Give me a list. Tell me what to do. Like, I'll do the dishes. Like, don't you feel better? And you're like, no, it's not enough for me. Then there's the mental, which is the thinking through of the steps or making a grocery list, or at work, a lot of that's mental. Like, I got to return emails, got to like edit the podcast, got to do the things. And then the third is really the kicker. This is where the disconnect comes in. And that's the emotional labor of home and family life. And what this is it's really like these routine cause and effect calculations that we make to try to maximize positive experiences of members of our family. So this is like where the stakes feel high. This is where we're thinking through how do we, take our toddler out of the house and minimize all the possibilities of them having a tantrum. It's my worry about my son not eating breakfast before a baseball game and eventually it leading to a lower self-concept because he gets benched. It's like this future projecting that feels really massive. And the struggle with the emotional labor is that it's very much invisible. If we don't have somebody who thinks exactly like us through these cause and effect things, it's hard to really hand it off. You can't really pay somebody to do this unless they really know you and your family well. And it follows you everywhere, on vacation, to work. It follows you everywhere. So here's the final piece. When it comes to home and family life, where all these 3 circles overlap is what I call the triple threat. And the triple threat is when a single task involves things from each domain, which is almost everything in home and family life. Dinner is not just making dinner. Dinner is thinking through what's in your pantry and your fridge and making a grocery list and going to the store and actually cooking it and cleaning it and also thinking through everybody's food preferences, allergies, and all of the things. So when we explain it to our partners, one by one, each task can seem kind of silly. They'll be like, I don't understand what's wrong with you. Like, make a list. Tell me what to do. I'm happy to help. And then we feel kind of, we can have a number of reactions. We can like feel kind of small and embarrassed, or we can feel frustrated but not know how to articulate it. But the reason why we feel so overwhelmed is because we're pulling from each domain with every single thing in our home for the most part. It's like we can unpack stuff to like tiny little suitcases to involve things from each domain. And that's why it's so heavy. That's why it's so full. And that's the piece that our partners tend to not really understand.
That is so exactly what happened. I was so embarrassed. And even when I said it to you, I'm like, it's more than just setting up the appointment. That takes seconds. It's like all the things involved. Like, just like you said, dinner isn't just making dinner. That's like a huge light bulb moment for me. And I felt so embarrassed. And I'm like, I listed like 3 things like I did for you. And he's like, I don't get it. I'm like, what? And I'm like, but sobbing. And yeah. And then I just felt like, okay, well, I should be able to handle this. And then I'm like, okay, Katie, like put on your bootstraps.
Yeah. It's like now, and that's the piece that I find like you're not alone in that, which is that we'll explain it and then we feel kind of embarrassed a lot of times and then we judge ourselves. We should be able to do these things. And it really doesn't move us forward in our partner understanding, our partner taking more initiative, and us getting a little bit of relief. And so even in my book, I start with, okay, let's get real clear. And I walk through an example and I have a diagram even, because visual is really important sometimes to understand this, which is like, let's get really clear what it is and why it takes up so much space and why, if you're a non-default partner, why your partner is like walking around the house like a stress tornado and you're so confused. Like, let's get on the same page here.
Okay, so where do we start? Is it a conversation with our partner? Is it getting clear on like, I know for me, when I go into quote unquote, like more important conversations, I have to have notes. Otherwise, like I just go into a 15 story and like start crying or something. And then Andrew, the second I start to get too emotional, he shuts down. That's just, I know this dynamic and it hasn't worked for us in the past. So I'm like, okay, I have to be very objective. And, like I can still be emotional, but the second I feel overwhelming to him, he's like, and he gets defensive. And I know you've talked about these dynamics in your book and your content. So is it just me getting clear on like defining that so I can explain it better? And what about for people who've tried, like maybe I have to explain it and maybe it didn't hit, they got defensive, reactive, they started going like, well, I have a mental load too, just like you saying, like tit for tat, you do this, like where do we start?
So first I want to hit on one thing you said. I haven't talked about this much on other podcasts. I feel like it's worth mentioning, which is that the experience of talking to your partner, if it's a typical relationship, you're talking to a man and it seems like you get emotional and they shut down. That is an incredibly common experience. And then the second thing is the defensiveness is an incredibly common experience. When I was researching my book, I came across a couple of studies that talked about emotional reactivity in men and specifically looked at them when they were infants. And then there was another study that looked at them when they were adults. And what they find is that men actually react with higher intensity emotion and react much faster to like emotional cues than women do, which is wild because we would think that actually women are much better at reading these things. What they found is as men get older, they learn how to kind of mask that, but that emotional sort of stuff is happening behind the scenes. So when we come to our partners and they seem to sort of like shut down, disconnect, or shy away from emotions, it's almost like they can't handle it. And I'm not making excuses. It's like information is just supposed to empower us. It's not necessarily to say, I accept this as reality, therefore that's the end. But it's helpful to know like what's going on behind the scenes, and it's on them to sort of own that and learn how to regulate and manage better. But it's helpful for us to know what's going on. It's like they got a pretty intense emotional world that we are not always very aware of. So just kind of putting that out there, I thought that was helpful as I was researching and writing the book. So there's lots of things we can do when we want to start to shift this in our relationship. So one of the first is to, yes, have a conversation. And that's always the hardest one. Some people will push back, and maybe I spend too much time online, but some people will push back and be like, why do I have to do more to have this conversation as a woman? I'm already carrying so much, and I get it and I agree. And also, if you want it to change, then you're going to have more motivation. And who's better to try to shift it than you? So I believe that one of the most helpful sort of postures we can take when we enter into this conversation is to talk about the mental load, the modern demands of family life, the pains of hustle culture, the pressure to always be productive, the distraction of our devices, the intensity of our parenting standards, all these things as the common enemy in our relationship and family life. This is the enemy, and it's you and I, it's the two of us versus all these things. And let's come up with a plan. And then to talk about the impact of the mental load on you as an individual. So as we're navigating this, like I think we need to make some adjustments because I'm noticing that I am so overwhelmed that I feel like I can't relax in our life. And I'm sure I'm not as fun and pleasant to be around. I don't like who I am when I feel this way. And also I notice it's impacting how I feel toward you. And so I want to own that and then step into, okay, what can we do about this to find a better way forward that feels good to the both of us? So trying to kind of like neutralize it as you get into it, I think is really, really important.
I love that perspective shift. And I think, I've gotten caught up with this. Sometimes I don't know if it's just default or culture. Maybe it's just the amount of information we learn. It can very much feel like you're going into a battle when you have this conversation. Like, I'm like, okay, here's my talking points. If he says this, I say this. If he says this, I'm going to do this. And we do that with our kids too. Like, oh, I got to tell River to clean up his room or whatever, and it's like, hold on. How can we talk about it? And I love this. That's the enemy. It's getting in the way. Here's how it's impacting me, our family life, and that's impacting you. So how can we solve this together? And I approach housework cleaning rooms, living, like contributions, all the things the exact same way with my family. So it totally makes sense to me that I would approach the same thing with Andrew or even my kids the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and a lot of times, it can turn into a battle. So I don't want to deny reality. And unfortunately, sometimes we can have this like really wonderful startup to the conversation and they still react with some defensiveness. And I talk about lots of ways of doing this, but I think like handling it if they get defensive. I talk about that in the book. But I think too, like another thing you can add to the beginning of that conversation, and some people don't like this, but I find it very helpful, which is that you say something like, the conversation I want to have with you can sometimes stir up defensiveness. And I want you to know that's not what I'm after here. So you sort of like name your intention. Okay. So I'm wanting to know, number one, can you handle it right now without getting defensive? Because this is taking a lot of courage for me to come to you and say this. And number two, I want you to know that my objective is to become closer with you, to feel better about how we do family life. It's not to attack you. It's not to put you down. It's just that this isn't working. We need to find another way. So can you handle this right now? Most times they'll say yes, even if they can't. And so what that does when you sort of get buy-in before you enter into the conversation is it does two things. One, if they start to feel defensive, they're going to pause for a minute, because if they said they can handle it and then they actually can't, then it makes them look bad. And so they pause. The second thing is if they get defensive and they said they could handle it, you have some accountability there where you can say, whoa, hold up. You said you could handle it. I feel like you're getting defensive. What's going on? Do we need to hit pause, or can you handle this? Because again, this takes a lot of vulnerability and courage for me to come to you. And so it can help kind of slow down the conversation if defensiveness shows up. And I do want to say, if you take notes, that's a great strategy. There's nothing wrong with going into a conversation with an outline or your talking points, because a lot of us get really flooded. And when our partner does a pushback or something, we sort of lose our way and we lose our thoughts. And that's very normal. And I highly recommend writing down what you need to say if that helps you sort of stay on track and sort of like maintain your strength through the conversation.
When I go back to Andrew and say, you know how I started crying on the plane last year, describing how I was feeling overwhelmed going home. I mean, in that conversation and let's just say I do that. And he's like, okay, I can see more of what you're saying. Thanks for explaining that to me. And he is super empathetic. If I explain things the right way, I don't want to say the right way because that means there's a wrong way. But if I say it in a way that's clear to him, I'll put it that way, like you described, he's like, okay, how can I help? So at what point do we also have something maybe in our outline, or like the one task that maybe we're really struggling with right now, or the one that's just taking up a lot of mental real estate? Do we have something ready like that? What does that look like on a tangible day-to-day level?
So I'll give some specifics and then I'll give you like the big picture takeaway. So you sort of have to know what you want when you go into the conversations. It's like, what's your objective when you go into it? And a lot of times we are really unclear with our needs in our relationships. Like for years, I would say to my husband, can you just be more romantic? And he's like, yeah, okay. And then nothing changes, or like I get flowers the next week, which that's actually not what I was after. And then it goes back to normal. And what I learned was like, he doesn't really understand what being romantic means to me. I had to be a little bit clearer. And I think when we're clear, what we're actually going to describe to our partner is the deliverable. Like, what is the deliverable of our ask? Not just some like ethereal concept. And so I think going into the conversation, it's helpful to know exactly what you want to change. Another way to get clear on it, if you're not sure, is if things were handled in an ideal way. Imagine it's caught on camera, like it's filmed in your home. Things are happening exactly how you want. Now take that video footage and kind of write it out or describe that to your partner. So it's like, this is the ideal way that this need is met. So I think that's really important and can be helpful when we go into this conversation. If we're just say things like, I want you to take more initiative, what does that mean? That's not clear. And I know that's one of our greatest desires from our partners. Or I want more participation. Well, in what ways? So get clear. I always joke, and I think a lot of men are this way, but and you might not get it if you don't watch the Lego movies, but my husband is like Emmett from the Lego movies, where it's like he wants a set of instructions. And a lot of men are like that, where it's like they sort of just are kind of by the book, and it frustrates us, but let's work with this difference and let's move it forward so we can feel better in our relationship. So that's one piece. Another piece is, sometimes shifting it is like just handing off one massive thing. So years ago, for some really stupid reason, I handled our finances. I am not good at that. Like, I'm like, oh, we're just getting by this month, every month. Like, I'm just not good at it. My husband's in business. Like, what are we doing? So years ago, I was like, take it. You got it. And that actually unpacks to include a lot of things, our investments and how we save and how we set things aside for vacations and who calls the bill, like the insurance company when we get charged too much. It's like all that is now on him. And one single task was really a huge load off that shifted things in a massive way. So remember that. And I'll give one more thing, which is sometimes what we really want is just appreciation and to be acknowledged. And that's like the easy grab that a lot of partners miss, because it's like one thing to do it all. It's another thing to do it all and feel like nobody notices it. And so that is something that I think we can ask for that actually does really move the needle in our actual experience of our relationship. But ideally, I think what couples need to work toward is that we got to work toward having regular touching base moments around the mental load, because it shifts literally every day. If somebody's homesick, it changes. So if every time you talk about it, you're making notes and you're worried about Andrew getting defensive and all these things, you're going to continue to absorb all the tasks. So we have to get good at talking about it regularly. So it's a natural rhythm of our family life.
Oh, so good. I have okay. So the appreciation piece, yes, actually, this is a newer thing for me, but I've been kind of passively, aggressively, almost on a daily basis, being like audibly sighing at the end of the day and being like, oh, I spent 10 minutes today figuring out the carpool schedule. And I'd be like, oh. And all I want is for him to go, thank you for taking the time to do that. Because he just looks at the schedule that I make. Do I drive or not drive? Right? I just need to tell him. And I think so many times, instead of just, and I get it, a lot of it, I shouldn't have to tell my husband to tell him, well, what else do we do? At some point. And honestly, it would make me feel better. And for him to just be like, oh, that's what you want?
Yeah.
Like,
I know.
I don't know. Like, well, hello, Katie.
I know. And it's annoying. This single issue was probably the argument that went on for 10 years in my relationship, because I could not figure out exactly so I'd be like, oh, I need more like appreciation. And he would say, well, you're a good mom. And I was like, no, you said that once about like our old neighbor. Like that means nothing. That absolutely means nothing to me. A good, that's so generic. And so then what happens, which is wild how like small things become big things all of a sudden, is that then he would say, I'd be like, no, that's not really doing it for me. And then he would say, oh gosh, you just need so much. I don't need that much. You need so much. Like, I don't know what you want me to do. That's not who I am. You trying to change me. Then it like spirals into this massive thing. And it's like, oh my gosh, I just wanted appreciation. So what we kind of like came to was like a couple of things that really helped, I think, shift his perspective and also like equipped him, because he is not, we love other people in the way that we like to be loved. So unless Andrew is like a words of affirmation guy, he's not gonna be that good at it. You know, he might be like, whatever, touch. And you're like, that's not what I need right now. So, we have to remember that, because it depersonalizes it. Instead of feeling like, well, my partner would show it if they actually appreciated me. It's like, no, they just might be out of their like zone of genius when it comes to meeting needs. So a couple of things. One, I pushed back when he started suggesting that I was needy, because that's baloney. And what I was asking for was totally reasonable. And this is sometimes really hard for us as women, because we're sort of conditioned to have no needs. But what I'd said to him was that he was like, I just don't need this. I was like, okay, let's talk about that one. I was like, you work for a giant company and you get paid every week. That is a reflection of your worth. That's an appreciation sort of gesture. It's this reciprocal relationship. I go, then you get a bonus that shows that you did a job well done. And then you have monthly meetings to review how you're doing, where you get feedback. And then I went to a 6-hour banquet once where the whole thing was about expressing appreciation to employees. So maybe it's that you don't need it, or maybe you just get so much of it. But my source of feedback in the home and family life is literally you. There is no other feedback loop for me. And so if you're not giving it to me, I'm not getting it. And I need this to sustain me. So that was like the first thing. When I said that to him, he was kind of like dumbfounded. He's like, oh, got it. He's like, okay. Because it's true, you know, as moms, and whether you work or not, but if you're doing the majority of the stuff at home, you're not getting any good feedback, really. It's like your kids complain and you're like, this is what I get. It's really important our partners fulfill that for us. The second thing is I explained how to give me a good compliment. And some people will be like, I shouldn't have to, but listen, if you want it, this is really helpful. And it's really simple. It's either an observation about something I do or who I am, plus how it makes his life better. Something like, I appreciate how thoughtful you are about what the kids put in their bodies, because it's something that I don't have to put any energy toward, and I know they're well taken care of. Thank you for doing that. I think that shift alone would dramatically change people's relationships.
Yeah, like my heart was like, oh, when you said, like, I want to hear that. Yeah.
Yes, or Katie, thank you for all the thought and time you put into the carpool schedule. I know it's annoying and frustrating and a lot of calculations. And when you do that, it allows me to just look at the schedule and show up for the kids. And it makes my life easier. Thank you. That's what you want to hear from him. How easy is that to do?
And versus just like you said, years. It's funny how a lot of these things drag on for years. I want to highlight something you said that I realize, like, so much of this great advice you're giving, like, you have to customize it to like personality types, right? Because one of the first things I started doing years ago is like, oh, regular check-ins. Like, that makes so much sense. We are a team. In order to be a team that is effective at what we're trying to reach, we have to communicate regularly. And Andrew will give all the time in the world to his business partners and like other people when it, like, because I don't know, but for whatever reason, when it was like, okay, it's time for our weekly meeting, and we sat on the couch after the kids were asleep, he was like antsy. He was uncomfortable. He was like, what do you have? And I'm like, oh, and then like that energy would stress me out, and I'd be like, oh, forget it, you know. And then we quit having the meetings, and I realized like his personality, when he's sitting down at a table, he can't do that. He has to move his body, and so we usually take walks after dinner anyway, but there's something about feeling less pressure when you're walking side by side, just on a road, we do laps. It's really simple. But I'll be like, hey, I noticed X, Y, and Z. Would you mind? Do you have time? Or like these conversations in a completely different environment where it doesn't feel so high stakes and like, oh, what's Katie going to bring to the table? What's Katie upset about? You know, because no one wants to feel like you're going to a meeting with your boss and they're going to rattle off the 5 things that you stunk at this week. And by the way, I also learned don't do that in your weekly check-ins either, because we always find what we're looking for, right? Every single day, what we believe in, what we're looking for, we find it. Our brain seeks it out. That's kind of just another side note. But the walking has made such a big difference. And like, so it doesn't have to look like sitting at a table and being all weird with each other.
Yes, I know. I'm so glad you do that. I'm so glad you brought that up. I think I put that in my book. And I'm trying to remember if I did but anyway, I always have felt like if counseling sessions with men could be like on a basketball court or while you're walking, things would actually move a lot faster. So doing that sort of active movement stuff as you're sort of having these check-ins is a wonderful tool and a great tactic. And it like lowers the stress and the intensity and that like face-to-face, like, what do you got for me? What have I done wrong this week? You know, entering into it with that sort of mentality just never really sets it up to go well. But I'm glad you're doing it, because the thing about doing these meetings that's really important, and there's lots, but 2 main things. One is that the more you talk about your relationship, the better you get at talking about your relationship. And it feels really awkward at first, but if you kind of push through that and get to a place where it's just normal, like my husband and I kind of just, it's incorporated into our dynamic all the time now. We don't really even have to set aside the specific time. We just do it. So in the beginning, things are always kind of awkward and automatic and like mechanical, and then they become more automatic over time. And so we need to push through the awkward. And then the other thing is that women are the ones who typically do the emotional work in the relationships. We're managing our relationship, and it starts to feel like, why am I the only one that cares about our relationship? And I think that's another source of frustration. And so when we put it on the calendar, when it's a regular thing in our home, we're sharing that piece of it. And that's a piece of the mental load. And so it takes something off of her plate and makes it a shared thing, which is really, really important.
What do you suggest for all like the single parent homes? I mean, if they don't have a partner to share the load with, I can imagine that feels even more overwhelming at times. Do we wait until our kids get a certain age? Is it like a co-parenting thing where perhaps they might not be under our roof, but we can still, I don't know, with all the transitions with kids in between the homes, work things out that way? What do you recommend?
This is like a really tricky one that I was actually talking with somebody this morning on in my DMs about. She's like, what about single parents? I'm like, I'm sorry. But I think there's a number of things. I think one, you have to be a much better self-manager when you are doing things solo in order to avoid burnout. And, you know, it takes a lot of stamina to be a single parent and to do this stuff on your own. And so I feel like my first book kind of like addresses like, how do you take care of yourself in a way that helps you avoid getting burnt out? And so that's one piece I would say. I think, you know, involving our kids becomes a really important part of this, and we can do that from a pretty young age. And so that's another piece. And you know, it's not really adding more to our plates because we're already parenting. We're already trying to get our kids to clean up and participate. It's just sort of being a little bit more strategic around helping to build initiative taking, which is what I think is important with kids. Like, how do we get them to see the things that need done and just take care of it on their own? And then the third is like co-parenting. And I haven't really gotten into this much in my work yet, but I think it's an area that needs further exploration and tools. But the co-parenting piece is huge, how you communicate. And it's probably like a similar solution, which is like, can you and your co-parent have regular check-ins about who's doing what? Is it always falling on one person when one of the kids is sick? Like, how do you navigate the holidays? Who's doing the gift buying? Who's taking care of that stuff? So really setting up some structure becomes way more important in a co-parenting relationship because you're not regularly seeing each other to navigate these things together.
Like you said, going into these conversations, knowing even still, sometimes I feel awkward, you know, because again, it's like on paper, calling the dentist, not a big deal, but like all the things involved with all these quote unquote little tasks. And I think you bring up a good point. Like, just because we've been married for 5, 10, 15, 20 plus years doesn't mean like that awkwardness isn't going to exist when we're having a new conversation. And a mentor years ago told me something about how, again, these regular check-ins he had with his wife, he considered them like marriage maintenance. Just like you change the oil in a car regularly, you don't think about it. It's just part of the process of owning a car. And I'm like, oh, like I thought I was just supposed to talk to Andrew about stuff when things get really hard or when there's a glaring issue. And even then I'd be like, we'll talk about it later. Because the awkwardness and like the what ifs and what if he takes it the wrong way and all these things. So
it's exhausting.
It is. It
yeah.
is.
It's weird how in every other area of life we do these maintenance things. It's almost everything. Like you have a house plant, you're going to water it. You work somewhere, you're probably having lots of meetings. And if you like think about this too, like my husband's in the business side of things. So it's like he'll go in and then they'll like ream him for financials not being where they are. And it's like, okay, so he takes that information and it comes with a plan. He's not like, I'm the worst employee. You know, it's just like we can depersonalize in other areas of life. We do these regular maintenance things in other areas of life, but then in our most important relationship, we neglect it. And it's absolutely wild. But I think that this belief that we only talk about our relationship when something is wrong is really hindering our ability to enter into these conversations. And to me, it makes sense because if you think about like dating years, anytime somebody said, can we talk? It meant you were going to break up. So it's like, we're kind of conditioned in relationships that like, if you talk, it's over. Things are bad. Things are not good. And so we have to shift that thinking to know that, okay, life is busy. Life with kids is really busy. Life when you're working, like life is always pulling our relationship toward disconnection. And if we can say, yeah, that feels true, then the next piece would be, then it means your relationship is always needing something. And if your relationship is always needing something, then it's your job to tend to it, to manage it, to talk about it, and to repair. It's not that somebody's doing something wrong necessarily or you're failures. It's just that it's normal to live in modern life for your relationship to be pulled toward disconnection. So we gotta shift our mindset around talking about our relationship.
I blame Disney. Part of me, I just had a flashback of think of like Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, and it's like the prince comes in and saves the woman, and they live happily ever after. And I'm like, really? She just reamed him out for leaving his pajamas on the floor. For that
and he's like annoyed she's nagging.
Can we have a part 2, Disney, where we talk about the realness? This is 2025. Come on.
I know. We don't have good examples.
No.
We really don't. Or it's like the sitcoms are like the dumb husband trope that's just everywhere. And then the naggy, frumpy wife. And you're like, this is not reality. We need some other examples. Oh gosh, I read rom-com books all the time. And it's the Disney formula in those two. And I'm like, this is wildly like unrealistic. But I love it.
But it like programs us, right? It's like, oh, this is what life like. Once you find the right person, you don't have to work for it. Like it's no one actively says these things that I know of. And if they do, like I don't follow them. But it's like it gets into your psyche and like, oh, well, this should feel easy. He should be this way. I shouldn't be struggling. And it's like we're shooting all over and it's not fruitful. So that cultural standard is kind of an interesting thing to dispel and declutter in order to be able to move forward. It's like, well, yeah, relationships are not always easy. And the other piece, I think another piece of marriage advice, and I know I've heard you talk about this, is this expectation that whether it's the mental load we're talking about or like the nitty gritty tasks, like should be divided 50-50, should be equal at all times. Like again, and part of this is like the teamwork aspect. Sometimes you have people like son plays flag football. Sometimes you have like someone who's running and doing a lot of the work and like scoring all these things. And like you have other people kind of just hanging out, waiting for them to get tagged in. So sometimes it's 90-10. Your husband travels a lot for work. You've been traveling. We're all lead busy lives, like you said. But I think I had to get over the fact that it needed to be completely even at all times. Like, and once I got past that, I was like, oh, okay, well, I was willing to work on it more. That was a big thing for me. Because I don't know if it's like an astrological sign, like it needs to feel balanced. It needs to, I couldn't outwardly say that. I didn't necessarily identify that until I was like, why am I so annoyed that like I took the trash out 3-4 days this week and he only took it out 3? Because there's 7 days in a week, Katie, like chill, you know?
I think there's a lot of people who struggle with that. And I think, I think we have to switch the gauge to it. Does it feel fair? So it's like 50-50 is not a good gauge because for lots of reasons. We all have different circumstances in our life, and sometimes one person is busier and has more going on than the other. So we got to be able to have some like flexibility and fluidity to step in and manage it together well. But I think feeling a fairness, and I know fairness is subjective. I unpack that in the book, so it's tricky. Like they might be like, feels fair to me. And you're like, not to me. You've got to get good at touching base about like, how are things feeling around this fairness issue, because that is really the thing that will start to lead toward resentment in the relationship.
So I know my listeners are going to want more of your wisdom. You have your first book that we talked about in one of your last episodes. Can you mention that one? And also your newest book?
Yeah. So the first one's called Love Your Kids Without Losing Yourself, 5 Steps to Beat Burnout and Banish Guilt When You Already Have Too Much to Do. I think we already just changed the subtitle, but I can't remember. It's for moms. It's for moms. And it's a framework for how you really care for yourself in a meaningful way. It's not about pedicures or like self-care in a typical sense, but it's almost like individual therapy sort of in a book, but with some really practical tools. And then the second book is out April 8th, and it's called A Better Share, How Couples Can Tackle the Mental Load for More Fun, Less Resentment, and Great Sex. It's been fun because I'm just now starting to get early reader feedback. And from men too. And one of my biggest objectives was to make it a book that couples could go through together. And it's not going to stir up defensiveness, but rather foster like a really deep understanding of one another so we can move through these conversations with ease. I'm really excited about it. And I think it's really going to help couples find a lasting and deep, meaningful shift in their relationship around this area.
One thing I love about your work, and another reason I'm so excited to get my hands on your newest book as well, is because we have so much information, just like you talked about, information overload, but it's the application a lot of us struggle with, the implementation. Well, what does this look like in a conversation? What does this look like on a tangible level? And just like me, it's like 30,000 foot view. Yes, I get it. This is great, but give me the nitty gritty. And all of your content, including your first book, which I've read and is incredible. Can't recommend that enough. And I also love the idea of this is created to read with your partner, not just you read it and be like, oh, here's all the things we need to work on. It's let's do this together. Again, teamwork attitude. And I know, here's the thing. My husband won't read a freaking book. He won't. I know it. So he's going to go, okay, great. Give me the cliff notes. And I am happy to do that. I'm going to do it.
Yeah. And I think, ideally both partners read it or listen to it or however you like to consume stuff. But I'm realistic and know that that won't always happen. And so either way, it will work for you and it will equip you with tools. And it covers everything too, from like, all the way up to very resistant partners. And like, how do you actually move through that defensiveness? It's sometimes you have a partner who won't. And then you're faced with a different decision. But a lot of times, because it's just so common, a lot of times you can move through it. And so I give like the technique, I give the script, how do you say it? What does it look like? And then I give the reason why it's impactful in those situations. So I really do give a lot of tools that you can just kind of like grab from the book and put to work in your relationship.
Imagine this one will be on bookshelves, like dog-eared, highlighted, got the sticky note. I used to not do that with books. I'm like, oh no, leave them the way you found them. And now I'm like, notes, like I don't care anymore. Like that's the point. I'm like, I need to know, I need my shortcut. So thank you for writing that. So we've got one, and I'll put, for all my listeners out there, I'll put Dr. Morgan's books in the show notes. So you can grab that link really quickly and check it out on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. One last question before we go. Another new tradition here on the show is, what is one thing in your home you'd never let go of and why?
Oh my goodness. I don't know how attached I am to things.
If you're questioning your sentimentality, you're not sentimental, but that's okay. It doesn't make you a bad person.
I am, but it's just like, I don't know that I have like that many sentimental things. I have a stuffed animal from when I was little. And his name is, so I had like an accident when I was 2 and somebody gave him to me and his name's Calvin and he's a little dog and I gave it to my daughter, but I think like that's something that I would be devastated to lose. So probably grab that.
Calvin, sweet Calvin is irreplaceable.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that answer. It's always funny to see where people take that. So it's so special. That is so special. I think there are absolutely things in life, and sometimes people get embarrassed by things like that, but it's about what Calvin symbolizes, right? In that moment for you and how someone came and said, here, take little Calvin. And when you're 2, oh my gosh, it means the world. So it's like, it's just another reminder that stuff isn't just stuff, it's what it represents, and the emotions and stories and memories. And so sweet Calvin, we're going to keep Calvin around, aren't
Yes.
we? Well, thank you so much for coming back on the show and sharing your wisdom with us as usual. Dr. Morgan Cutlip, it's always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.